Karen, I think this topic, Karen, of what makes successful implementation research grant proposals was something that came up when we asked individuals what they wanted to hear about. So part of that is a response to a high demand question, which is what makes for putting together grants. And I'm really thrilled to have wonderful colleagues today that will be working with us today in this discussion group. So I'm going to actually share my screen here. Hopefully I can do that. And go into into our slideshow mode here. So I assume everyone can see this. We're in slideshow mode. You're not looking at my email, which you really don't want to. Good, or my schedule, or any of our schedules. So, anyways, this is what we'll be doing today. The topic, as you all know, is what makes a successful implementation research grant proposal. And I thought it'd be fun to kind of take a little bit of a historical sweep. So I'm really thrilled to be on this Zoom with two highly valued colleagues. Several times ago, I was in the chair position thinking about what makes for good implementation research grants in what was called the DIRH, Dissemination, Implementation, Research, and Health Studies section. And I was thrilled at the time to have as my co-chair, Dr. Heather Brandt, who once I left the chair position, took over as chair of that study section and in its evolution, and she'll talk a little bit about that. And then subsequently, we have also Jeremiah Brown, Dr. Brown, who's a colleague of mine at Dartmouth, who we go way back to talking about implementation science many years ago, right, Jeremiah? And he's now the current chair. And just to give you a little bit of background, Heather is director of the HPV Cancer Prevention Program and co-associate director for outreach at St. Jude, and works in cancer control and works also with the University of South Carolina Arnold School of Public Health. And Jeremiah is a professor of epidemiology and biomedical data science, believe it or not, who saw the light and went from being an epidemiologist to being a implementation scientist, and has so much seen the light that he's now developing a center, is in the process of developing a training program in implementation science at Dartmouth, and runs a center in implementation science at Dartmouth. So the three amigos are going to give a little bit of a perspective on where we on how this looks like from the chair, knowing that we all have, I think, different perspectives. So the goal of this session is to have a chance to talk and to converse a little bit, to have a conversation. But we are gonna show some slides. I probably was the purveyor of this to some extent because I rely so much on them. But we're gonna have some slides, but we're gonna quickly go over some observations, kind of personal things that we've noticed on what seems to make a difference around things that do well and things that don't do so well. And then, because you're seeing a historical sweep, we'll talk a little bit about how it's changed, how have things varied over the years as it's developed, and then open it up for Q&A. So that's what we'll be doing. So with that, I'm going to start because going back several chairs, I'm going to talk about what I noticed from that position, and also what I noticed, by the way, as Karen and I and Natish and a whole bunch of us notice as we look at summary statements that come back with people that we mentor. So some of this stuff is things I think I noticed back then, and some of it's probably confused with things I notice now. But suffice it to say, some of these things will look pretty generic and not surprising. But I'm going to fly through mine quickly because I really want to give more time to Heather as well as Jeremiah. But I think just to kind of quickly go through things that really come to the top. Some of these things are very transparent and you are not surprising. You know, the rigor of the prior work, what's the gap? And one thing that we argue about a lot in study sections or in grants is the data good enough for implementation? Is the proof of the intervention good enough? Or does it need to be a hybrid type 2 or type 3? And is there a novel research question? But one thing that I learned pretty early on is that, you know, you sit in this study section that's made up of people who are from all different walks of research, from people that are anesthesiologists or psychologists or economists or nephrologists or primary care people, or, you know, it goes on and on. And so what's really important is to recognize that and to think about, regardless of whether or not you think that mental health is important or cancer is important or podiatry is important and toenails are the worst crisis in the United States, you know, whatever it is, more important is how is your question going to inform the larger field of implementation science? That's kind of a winning prescription, because you're going to have people that they're not necessarily worried about your problem or really understand pediatric cancer versus infectious disease, but they all want to see something that's going to move the dot around implementation science. So that's one thing to really think about, that in your significance is it's not just that cancer is bad or Alzheimer's is bad or depression is bad, but how is this significant in the realm of implementation methods? In terms of innovation, similar things. Does the research advance innovation in methods or in approaches or measures? Does it use ways that are going to translate into novel and robust findings? And does it engage approaches or topics that are important beyond simply getting something in place that's evidence-based? Equity, obviously something of great interest to many on this call, and we've talked a lot about that in this work group. But also, how do you kind of incorporate ways of developing good implementation strategies? Is it through user-centered design or adaptive designs or novel approaches, rather than simply saying we're going to do this and we're going to compare it to education? Well, that's a yawn, you know, and it's not necessarily going to move things forward. So thinking about moving the science forward and being a student of that. And then this is always comes up, right? Is there somebody on the grant who's a so-called card-carrying, implementation scientist? So I have my wallet here, and actually this is a T-Pass. This is not actually my card. Well, there is no card carrying, there's no card for implementation science, but it is the case that people will want to see that there's somebody on the grant who's got a history of funded grants, publications, posters, or something, or training, advanced training. And when does that become good enough is a really good question, you know? Where is that line? And it's not a clear line. And then finally, and I'll just finish up my comments really quickly, is where things really tend to go south is in the approach, almost always, right? And there, the issue of whether or not you're really been a student of contemporary implementation frameworks and strategies and measures. Are you just taking something off the shelf, or is it really something that fits the study well and the aims that you have? Are the aims really clearly articulated around these? Have you really been clear about differentiating implementation outcome measures from implementation process and context measures? You know, those are different, as we've talked on this work group. And then the idea of multi-level measures and analytic plans and multi-level outcomes, always important in thinking about different types of methods, mixed methods, et cetera. And then really important, in addition to equity, sustainment, practicality, and scalability. So those are just several very quick, high-level kind of things that I think are things that I think about a lot when I look at grants. as well as the generic stuff that we won't even go into. Are the aims clear? Are they focused? Are they interdependent? I mean, that's general, that's kind of grants personship 101. But I think hopefully these are some of the things that make sense. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Heather Brandt, who's embracing the holiday season with great enthusiasm, as you can see, and has also thought a lot about this topic around what makes for successful grants. So Heather, with that, I'm turning it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to follow Steve, who really highlighted a number of points that I also am going to make. Next slide, please. So thank you again for inviting me to the conversation today. I'm excited to hear from all of you as well. I'm Heather Brandt, as Steve noted, and I am the quote unquote prior chair of the Science of Implementation in Health and Healthcare Study section. I feel a bit like Prince in saying formerly known as the Dissemination in Research and Health Study section. So in my time today, I just want to build on what Steve has shared and share a perspective about how the firsthand experience of serving on study section and really reviewing grants of any type from any source really strengthens our own science as well as our strategy in grant writing too. Next slide, please. So a few things that, back one, please.
Okay, sorry.
So it's okay. So I first served on an NIH study section starting in June 2004. This was the Community Level Health Promotion, or CLIP, CLHP as it was known. I was asked to serve on CLIP because CLIP was part of the NIH Early Career Reviewer Pilot Program. The scientific review officer was Dr. Bill Elwood, and he called a longtime colleague and friend in South Carolina to ask for recommendations. And Susan Fulmer, who was a mentor and friend, recommended me and appear for this opportunity. So I was invited to serve as an ad hoc member of CLIP for about 6 years. I participated as a study section member. And from there, I served on special emphasis panels, NCI small grants, and center level grants study sections. I was eventually invited to serve on DIRH, Dissemination and Implementation in Research and Health, as an ad hoc reviewer, and eventually as a standing member, and then for chair for the final 2 years. The Early Career Reviewer program was truly a critical and foundational part of my development as a scholar. I was able to see firsthand how the sausage was made. I learned how to write better grants and help others write better grants, especially my mentees. And if you speak to any of them, they will tell you in their first semester of their doctoral program, they wrote their first grant. And we had great success with that process. So I received my first R grant just 2 years after I started serving on CLIP. And I honestly believe my good fortune and funding would never have looked the same had I not been given this opportunity to serve as an early career reviewer. And I think the same is true as I moved through my career, and even today, I met collaborators and made career-long friends through these experiences. Also, when you're serving on study section, you learn a little bit about how people chair the study sections. And you learn things that I think are really effective and make it a pleasure in which to participate. Because if you do the math, you're working for less than minimum wage to review these grants. So you have to find that value added to that labor that you're really giving away to the federal government and to other funding agencies too. So the first chair of CLIP who I saw in action was Dr. David Murday. And I have to tell you, the only thing I knew about him is that he wrote a green statistics book about N of 1 that I had to make my way through in graduate school. But I was able to learn from him and learn about the methodology of orchestrating a study section. I also learned from other chairs, including Dr. David Wetter, Dr. Mary Ellen Wewers, Dr. Michael Hecht. And then I was eventually invited to start chairing these NCI small grant panels in between, and then was invited back to DIRH with Dr. Melissa Simon, and then with Dr. Bartels as well, who continued to show me what it looked like to serve as a study section chair. And in my opinion, the best chairs routinize the process to eliminate intangibles that could influence the fairness and integrity of review of any single application. This means reading the names the same way, reading the titles the same way, calling on the reviewers in the same way. And this is how we set expectations for the importance of the task at hand. Well, I can tell you, I really tried hard to live up to those expectations of what I think of as the best or ideal chair. I certainly was far from perfect, but did try to perform at the level of these exemplars who came before me. It was easy, and Steve, you told me once, sharing a ride to the airport after one study section, when you have a group of fellow scholars as members of the study section who work so hard, it's your job to take advantage of all of that collective expertise in the room. And so it truly does really reflect the orchestration of multiple perspectives and trying to bring them together, not to consensus, which is not the goal of review, but to take those pieces and give people the piece to then consider how they would weigh it. And so I certainly thank you, Steve, and all of the other previous chairs, starting with David Murday, who showed me what that looks like. So from these experiences, I certainly learned a lot about dedication to the peer review. And just because I think it's funny, and maybe you already know how much fun I like to have since I'm sitting here with antlers on my head, I do work at St. Jude. Kids love that kind of stuff. I am so dedicated to peer review that I broke my leg a week before study section once, and I still went. And then when I was chairing my very first study section, in 2015, I had an appendicitis and actually had an appendectomy in DC. So this is how dedicated I am to this peer review. So you're hearing it from someone who's really committed to the process and sees a lot of value in it. Next slide. So one of the things I wanted to share with all of you are the remarks that I provide when I start out study section. And I think if we were to do a thematic analysis here to kind of pull out things I'm touching on, I'm definitely trying to emphasize the fairness and integrity of the review process, and also encourage each of the reviewers to hold themselves accountable to that standard. And it's important to set the stage for the course of the study section. I watched Steve do that. I am certain Jeremiah is doing that now, but it really is important to kind of put it out there. Like this is an important job. This influences people's careers, people's livelihood, the teams they employ. So we should give it our all during this time period. And so here's just an example. This was my final study section. I never got to chair this study section in person. All of my chair positions for this study section were virtual, but you can see how I try to emphasize those points that Steve was making earlier as well about significance and about impact and about advancing the field. Next slide. And I learned this from a previous chair, and I think it's so important to frame the review is with these two key questions. So the first one, as a reviewer, you should articulate is based on your expert review, should it be done? And that speaks to the significance, the innovation, the qualifications, if it's an R01 or another style of grant or mechanism of grant that allows for preliminary work. You know, is it the case there? Should this be done? And the second part ties into the approach. Can it be done well? So this speaks to the quality of the science, the rigor of prior research, the clarity of a scientific premise that's coming through. And so it boils down really to these two, what I think of as key questions. Next slide. So I just want to emphasize a few things that I think affect an application in study section. And part one is the process that you take to writing a grant. And as Steve said earlier, some of these are just a grantsmanship, and that's really not the focus today. But in particular, for these style of grants that we're writing, I do think that there's some advantage to taking this process to a next level almost. I think it's really important to engage your program officer in the institute or center you're targeting. I think now there are so many institutes and centers who have signed on to the D&I FOAs as they're available. So that means there's even more program officers. My wheelhouse is in cancer, so I'm generally almost always going to NCI, although I've also gone to NINR. I've also gone to NHLBI. In fact, my RO1s was from NHLBI and such. But engaging those program officers, especially as it relates to implementation science, because of the second point here about how you have the opportunity to align and integrate funder priorities. NHLBI is a great example. They recently released a new strategic plan for their funding priorities. Dissemination and implementation science is clearly identified as a priority for them. Drive that point home. Taking advantage of NIH Reporter, I think that really helps to make sure that we're aware of what's already out there being tested or being done. Not that you can't do it differently or perhaps improve upon that, but just having that awareness also can lead you to some articles that maybe you've overlooked. And then Steve emphasized this point, although I didn't say a card carrying, that's what I mean here. You really need to demonstrate implementation science expertise as part of the grant. And this can come in a lot of ways. It can come in the bio sketch, in the opening statement. It can come and be highlighted under the approach in terms of the strengths of the team. There also are other places in the application where if you have the experts provide you with letters of support to really outline how they have that implementation science expertise. So don't feel restricted about where you can demonstrate this type of expertise. Of course, to write grants, very clearly and concisely, as well as persuasively, and take advantage of external review. This is just really important. That means your timeline has to move up. That's a challenge when the feds release an FOA that's due in a week. I'm exaggerating a bit, but just a little bit. You really need that time up front. That's why I have, this, how long does it take to make this recipe? Well, it has to marinate sometimes for, about a year to a year and a half, and maybe even longer as you're developing the idea, strengthening it, and going through the funding cycle. Next slide, please. And the second part of a recipe for success of a D&I grant application is really the application itself. And these are points that Steve has really driven home in his remarks. I think that there's a really important piece in grantsmanship that is equally important here, and that is your aims page, and really using that as the cornerstone of your proposal. Steve also talked about the evidence. Make sure that your evidence, that rigor of prior work, the evidence, and thinking about Megan Lanefall's subway of translational research, is what you propose ready for an implementation science design, maybe a hybrid design or others. And then really making sure that you're showing clearly how determinants link to your implementation strategies, that link to how the evidence-based intervention is going to be effectively implemented. And just be clear about it. In the cancer world in particular, there's a lot of ambiguity In the community guide, for example, for colorectal cancer screening, there are all these quote unquote interventions like provider reminder, provider assessment and feedback. Some people view those as implementation strategies and not evidence-based interventions. I don't think, in my experience, reviewers get too far in the weeds, but you do have to be clear about how you're applying that evidence. Are you using them as the intervention, or are you using those? Is colorectal cancer screening your evidence-based intervention, and you're using those as strategies? Just be clear. Align and integrate your theories, models, and frameworks. If you're using them, make sure that they're aligned and integrated. I think per Nilsson, Sarah Birkin, and others make a good case for using more than one framework. I think when you get more than 3, you're getting into an area where it's pretty hard to justify, and you just don't have the space in an application to really be able to do that integration. Pay attention to areas that are important. I didn't put policy on here. I'm looking right at Karen. I should have, but attend to things like engagement of a target audience, key allies and partners, health equity, connectedness, and also how what you're doing perhaps aligns with policy, the policy health learning systems approach, and other policy frameworks that exist. Next slide. And additional ingredients may be needed as well. So, we want your recipe to be for success. I just shared this handout by email earlier this year in May for the Cancer Prevention and Control Research Network, of which I'm an affiliate. We prepared this document with some implementation science grant writing resources, including some articles that we feel are really key to addressing many of those key ingredients. Links to the funding opportunities, and also examples of successful grant applications. So I think in my experience, starting back in 2004, all the way through my chair, I've definitely seen application evolution and their sophistication, how people use tables and figures so well these days. There's definitely been a lot of growth. I don't get a box from FedEx anymore. I get a link to ERA Commons to review. So there's been a lot of changes in that time. But the one thing that stayed consistent is a focus on fairness and integrity of the applications based on the criteria. Next slide. So thank you so much. I used definitely more than the time, my time that was allowed, and I look forward to hearing from Jeremiah and answering your questions as well. Thank you.
Great. So I'd like to introduce Jeremiah Brown, who's the current chair. So Jeremiah, it's all.
Great. I will start with contributing what every chairperson loves to hear. I have nothing more to contribute. So, sorry, internal joke. So yes, thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today. And just as a brief background, so I started functioning as an ad hoc reviewer on study sections, including BCHI, DRH, and then became standing study section members in DRH, and then along with under Heather's leadership, moving into the new standing study section of SIHH. And it's a pleasure to follow both you, Heather, and Steve, and I've learned a lot from both of you along the years. So I want to start with first and build off of what Heather and also Steve were mentioning, but consider first mechanism. This is not a review criteria that we discuss in the study section, but be careful about aligning your research and where it currently stands in its readiness to the appropriate announcement. So next slide. So I'm going to try to build off of the great expertise that Heather and Steve both shared by really drawing you to basically the R01 mechanism in DNI, the 22105, and specifically call out the sort of more fine print of the FOA. And these are areas that I'm not going to read through, but I think are a good reminder for you to use as a checklist in terms of your submission and readiness, and also rigor of your methods that you're putting forward. So first is starting with under the specific objectives and scope in the FOA, and this describes close to a dozen key characteristics of DNI research that applicants could consider. I'd probably not say could consider, but I'd say should consider. And many of these elements are key attributes of strong proposals. So next slide. So then we look at, Steve made a great general introduction to the significance, investigators, innovation, and approach. And specifically in the DNI FOAs, they call out these additional specific areas to the DNI FOAs. And these are for in each of the scored areas of significance, investigators, innovation, and the approach, as well as other areas like the environment and human subjects. So for instance, when we look at significance, specific areas beyond the general review criteria for a significance section, specifically for DNI, is looking at areas that are related to dissemination and implementation and how that knowledge could be advanced. Specifically, how is your application addressing a broad reach, or how will it be achieved, and how equitable will the reach be if it is achieved? And also considering resource requirements and costs of the intervention. So these are things that commonly are not incorporated into significant sections, but specifically in the DNI FOA, they're calling these things out for you to strongly consider. So next area, we'll talk about investigators.
Oops, sorry.
Sorry, back one. So Steve and Heather mentioned about developing your team and having sort of a card-carrying implementation scientist. So what the DNI FOAs are also engaging the applicants to consider is multidisciplinary teams that have broad-reaching expertise across the spectrum of areas of expertise in conducting good DNI research. And one thing to make a point on, CSR is really trying to drill down on what we call sort of investigator bias. So we're being much more rigorous around evaluating the investigative team, and not just by including an implementation scientist as a co-investigator is really not enough. That person needs to be engaged in the development, and also other experts in your whole team be engaged in the development of your grant, of your proposal, and also very intricately engaged in the methods. So if you're including Steve, which is a great investigator to have on your grants, the point is Steve's expertise showing up in your actual approach and methods? Is his expertise or Heather's expertise showing up in your methods and design of your proposal? And if it's not, we need to be careful, and as chair, we need to be careful that people are not just providing strong investigator points because Steve or Heather are co-investigators on the grant or a PI themselves. So that's something that we need to monitor within our study section. And another sort of key area here, and I think Heather made this point in terms of developing your team. Take your time in developing your team. So you don't want to be developing your team in the last 6 months going into submission. You want to be developing and collaborating with your team and including them on your pilot research papers or pilot funding. So that demonstrates more of a track record of working successfully together. If you can show that your multidisciplinary experts have published with you and also have been on pilot grants or other funding with you, and that will form sort of a strong investigative team for your submission. So next point. So moving on to innovation, not many new areas here, but really is your proposal and your work really trying to move the ball forward in the DNI space, as well as within the clinical context or population context that you're trying to move forward. So just be mindful of that. And then next slide. So the approach. So Heather and Steve touched on many of these points. And I think one thing and I think Heather brought this out, but when you're talking about your frameworks, and just make sure that you're doing due diligence and sort of mapping your frameworks so to the appropriate sort of domains and concepts in terms of the measures that you're doing. And also it's a strength if you've been able to publish or conduct prior research or pilot work using those frameworks or theories in the past. And those are really sort of help move it forward along the way. Another sort of key area in terms of the approach is to be careful about the codependency of aims. So this is somewhat alluded to here, but it's often an issue for applicants, and especially in the D&I space, to progressively build on aim 1 to aim 2 to aim 3. And you need to try to, if you can, try to propose standalone aims that are not contingent on the successful completion of a prior aim. That's not always possible, especially in our D&I work, but it's something to be mindful of, or at least address that, yes, I acknowledge that aim 2 is dependent on the completion of aim 1. However, I have this strong preliminary evidence to show that aim 1 is feasible. We're halfway there. We just need the funding to sort of complete this work. So it's really low risk to get aim 1 done. And so you shouldn't be concerned about the codependency of aim 1 successful completion to aim 2. So just be mindful of that, and also be acknowledge some potential codependency in what your alternative approaches or limitations of having that approach in your proposal. Okay, next slide. So also be careful about environment. So being from Harvard, that's great. You're going to do great. But also we are, being trained in sort of looking at not only investigator biases, but institution biases. So it's no longer sufficient to say, yes, you're coming from an Ivy League institution with strong resources, but are the applicants actually positioning and influencing the large networks capable of taking the results of the proposed study forward? Are you leveraging your existing infrastructure in D&I to position the successful completion of your aims and what you propose? So this is where you're going to be developing in your facilities and environment sections, but specifically call out and identify where the unique infrastructure is and how that is aligned to your proposal, that where your institution is going to be supporting your proposal, and it falls in a sort of an umbrella network that's supporting your proposal and has a high likelihood of success. So try to point that out in your facilities and environment sections as well. Okay, next step. So these are additional review criteria. And specifically, this is basically saying that these are not areas that are getting individually scored, but can impact the overall score of your proposal. So next slide. And one area I want to draw on is sort of the additional review criteria of inclusion of women, minorities, and individuals across the lifespan. And the intention from CSR and the NIH here is that we're conducting research that is generalizable to the US population. And we need to be careful about this in the development of our proposals, because often research might inadvertently exclude certain populations or inadvertently exclude certain populations that we might not be intending to. And so we need to be careful of this, especially when we're completing our inclusion and exclusion criteria based on sex or gender, race, ethnicity, and other areas. And also try to propose and build your science around areas that are including populations from across the lifespan. It's not always possible, but make every effort to try to do so. Okay, next slide. So to make my point here, and this is going into our question and answer period, but maybe it'd be slightly interactive. But consider these two examples. One, you're conducting breast cancer screening, and you're going to restrict your enrollment to women over the age of 45. And the second example, that you're conducting prostate cancer screening, and you're going to restrict your enrollment to men over the age of 45. So can anyone say whether this is appropriate or potentially not capturing all sex, gender, or age in the proposal? Anyone? Don't make me call on Steve.
Oh, no. It looks like breast cancer occurs in men is one of the notes.
Okay, so
So,
the restriction to women alone.
also
might
in
be
younger
considered-
women. Why, Julie said, why 45? What's the point? Why that cutoff? What's the justification? Julie said, in the notes here.
Great.
So justifying the age, thinking about gender and thinking about, the issues around the epidemiology of this and thinking more broadly and justifying it sounds like is what people are worried about here, Jeremiah, in terms of the example.
Great. So if you are, thank you for those contributions, and Steve for reading them. So yes, if you're including an age cut point, make sure you clearly justify that and use the scientific literature to justify that cut point and why it's necessary for your proposal. And also be careful about sort of binary positionings of both sort of men and women in your inclusion or exclusion criteria, and make sure that you are including all individuals, even non-binary identifying individuals, in your proposals. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully that added something to what Heather and Steve provided.
Great. Thanks to both of you. Those are just terrific overviews. And so we're open now and both to chat questions or to specific questions, queries that you have about grants and how to develop good ones and how things have changed over time. I know that when I started, we were looking at type 1 hybrids, and type 2 and type 3, and type 1 hybrids have been thrown off the bus. It's like, no, you should be doing those anyways. And so there's lots of things that have been evolved, and they're now in other study sections. But questions for Jeremiah or Heather, or comments?
Steve, I wanted to add something that may be of interest to some of you, and maybe you're already members and familiar, but Collaborative for Anti-Racist Dissemination and Implementation Science has been convened. It's called CARDIS by the acronym, and they're working on one of the ideas in progress is a document that's focused on fostering equity and anti-racism in dissemination and implementation peer review processes. And they have provided a handout that has articles that are describing the current nature of the problem and also potential paths forward. And so I'm be happy to share that as well if people are interested. There also are some what they're called Padlets. I'll put those links in the chat, and you can go and review the information that's being crowdsourced with ideas and see what's already posted there. Jeremiah alluded to the inclusion and how we are embracing inclusion and thinking about that. This is very much related to how we ensure that our practices in peer review are inclusive and really attending to the wide range of populations affected.
Great, thanks for that. I see Courtney, you have your hand up. Would you have a question or comment?
Yes, I do. I have a question. Oh, hi. I think this is a question for Steve. It was about the comment about wanting to innovate around the implementation science methods, as well as whatever the kind of health area that you're focusing on. I understand where that's coming from, and that makes sense. But then, would you suggest that an application that is not that's using implementation science, but that's not innovating the implementation science methods themselves, but the innovation lies in the actual, use of those methods for the health topic? Would you suggest that this go to the study section, or are there other study sections that would actually have the expertise to to review an implementation science grant that is not about the implementation science methods?
I'd love to hear the other other colleagues here on that. But what I was trying to get at was that often if people come to the study section talking about how bad the illness is that they're worried about and wanting to do something about it, and then pose very generic kind of implementation strategies and outcomes, it may not do well in this study section. It may do well in another one, but in this one, it's really, there's a lot of interest in moving the science forward, not just the public health forward, which is also really important, by the way. But I think it's in responding to this RFA, this RFP, this mechanism, that there's an interest in seeing that. And it doesn't mean you have to use really innovative methods. I maybe overemphasize that, but that there needs to be more than simply addressing a public population health problem by testing a couple of strategies that are relatively generic that might move the dot. But for this study section, it's like, not so innovative. You know, we've seen lots of people doing audit and feedback, comparing it to such and such, and using re-aim. I mean, I don't know, you know. So that's more of the comment, if that makes sense. I don't know whether Heather and Jeremiah, where you'd sit on this.
Courtney, you asked a really common question that we get asked in panels, and recently David Chambers talked about, and I just put a paraphrase of the essence of what he shared, was in your application, you have to be very clear if your application is seeking to advance implementation science. So maybe that's the methods, the mechanisms, the underlying application and understanding of framework or theory model framework integration. Or if, as Steve said, there's a gap in application. And so you're applying implementation science for population benefit. Both are fine. And there's no, we're not saying one is more or less valuable, but it really does set up your application for those questions that Steve was asking about. Like, okay, so your toenail fungus is the worst in the world, right? This is a huge problem. But then if that's the path that's being taken, and then you're just applying some very surface level, that's going to raise some considerations in review that maybe aren't going to be as favorable.
Yeah, and I would just add that, I think it's stresses the importance of working with the program official and having them review your specific aims, as well as working with your local mentors to get a read on which study section is best. Because once it is assigned, that ball is rolling.
Great point. Other questions, either in the chat or raise your hand. This great question, Courtney. Or thoughts from Karen or from Natish or senior people around what they've seen and whether this all makes sense or other things we've left out?
I really appreciated hearing from Jeremiah the way NIH is starting to review or push panels to review investigators and environment a little bit differently. It's been a while since I've been in a study section. I haven't seen that. And as a reviewer, it's often it's good enough. And it's always felt uncomfortable. So I appreciate hearing more about that. And it sounds like, is that something that gets a lot of discussion, or is it just gets more scrutiny in individual reviews? Can you say just a little bit more about how that's playing out?
Yes, so I think the FOA calls out those points that are being emphasized pretty well. And it's just another area that we essentially, as chairs, have to, I think, manage in the review process to make sure that the discussion is, fair and equitable. Often, the SRO is there as well to sort of manage the discussion. And if things that come up that are not, score driving or score related issues, they're very, very good in terms of helping the chairs manage the discussion to keep it on point. So I think what the FOA is referring to is that it is your job as an applicant to clearly make the case for why your institution is excellent for the proposed research that's being done, and specifically what aspects of your institution or your broader multi-institution network will lead to a successful proposal.
Maybe I could just comment briefly. So thank you, first of all, Heather and Jeremiah. This was wonderful, and Steve for organizing. Such a treat to be able to hear from the inside chair and all of those perspectives. To maybe just for a second to speak to Courtney's question. So as somebody who does implementation science as an applier of it, to use David's kind of taxonomy, I think there are lots of institutes, and my work has been funded, our work has been funded by NIA, NIDDK, NHLBI, NIMHD, and all of these have implementation science aims in them as ways of understanding what are more typical type 1 type hybrid designs. And so I think there's a huge appetite for this and increasing ones. And when I sat on, for many years, I sat on NHLBI CLTR1, and there was a huge move to implementation and dissemination applications in the largest of NHLBI study section. And similarly in NIA, which is our predominant funders these days. And so suffice it to say that I think making this distinction clear that the D&I study section is about the science of D&I as an important entity, but the NIH as a whole is about D&I in many other contexts. And so you don't have to be a pure scientist to study theories, models, and frameworks in order to advance the discipline as a whole.
Nitish, that's such a great point. Yeah, I hope that I didn't oversell or we didn't miss that point. I think it's quite right. It's really this particular, as Jeremiah was going over, this particular announcement, this particular study section is about the science as much as is it about the public health problem. But there are other ways of making these applications that are absolutely, more generic around the public health application. I think I'm freezing a little bit. Eric.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the session. My main funder is the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, and I see that they're signed on. And I kind of wonder if they're one of the newer groups to sign on. And so I have a similar question to the last couple of, for our center, I think implementation research is relatively new and has just been part of the newer set of priorities from NCCIH, comparing that to like NCI or another institute that has a much longer standing focus on implementation. Are there different expectations for kind of the focus on methodology for something that would go through this study section that would get funded by NCCIH versus NCI? I'm not sure if that makes sense, but
So I'll speak to that. So alignment to the funders' priorities, so whether it's NCI, NIAD, et cetera. So those are not review areas that we address as a study section. So that's more at the council level after application is scored. So we are actually not permitted to determine or discuss alignments to priorities for the funding institutes.
Yeah, the other thing that we were told is we're not supposed to use the F word, funding. That the study sections are not about talking about what's fundable and what's appropriate to be funded. It's about scoring the merits based on the criteria that Jeremiah serves. So no F word, and that is at the level of council.
But I would add to that, it's the investigators and team's job to make the clear case for the rigor of the prior research. So although we're not allowed to discuss funding priorities or alignment thereof, and often it's commonly included, and rightly so, especially for the council level, or even to align it to the right study section. What you do need to make a strong case for is the rigor of the prior research and how you incrementally build on the rigor of that prior research. And some of that rigor of the prior research could be other people's work, but it also could be your own work or preliminary work that's driving your application forward.
Great. You know, we're really at the end. So and there are some good connections. Becca has some messages in the chat, and we have recorded this for posterity. I do want to add to Natisha's thanks for, this is a real treat to hear from the inside, and also to hear particularly from both Heather and Jeremiah, who have really been giving this a lot of thought more recently. So it's just been a delight, really interesting, very helpful, and want to thank both of you, and particularly Jeremiah, who is officially on vacation this week, told me, and is not calling in from Dartmouth College. And actually, there's snow on the ground. I know that's not a real picture, but thanks for joining, and also Heather, also thanks for wearing your antlers. We always appreciate your spirit here, and also your knowledge, really terrific. So thanks so much to both of you, and thanks for everybody for being here today, and have a great holiday.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.